In 1735, inside the glittering palace of Turin, Queen Pollixina of Hesse Rotenburg drew her final breath at only 28. No conspiracy, no battlefield, but a body worn down by relentless childbirth and illness. A gentle queen beloved by her people, yet she died in silence, her youth extinguished like a candle in the wind. Power could not shield her, history barely remembered her, and her crown became nothing more than a shadow over a forgotten grave. Polyxena Christina Johanna of Hesse Rotenburg was born in 1706 in the small spa town of Langenschwalbach, nestled among the rolling hills of western Germany. It was not a grand capital, not Vienna or Paris, but a provincial corner of Europe where noble families quietly maintained their place in the ever-shifting hierarchy of dynasties. For Polyxena, the cradle was never just a cradle. It was the first rung on a ladder built by others, a ladder she was expected to climb for the sake of her family's fortunes. Her father, Ernest Leopold, Landgrave of Hesse Rotenburg, presided over a minor principality, more name than power. Her mother, Eleonore of Loewenstein-Wertheim-Rochefort, came from another line of German nobility. Together, they gave Polyxena noble blood, but not the kind of power that could shield her from being bartered away in the marriage markets of Europe. In that world, daughters were not only beloved children, they were pieces on a chessboard, pawns that could secure alliances, stabilize fragile treaties, or bring dowries into the coffers of families always hungry for relevance. Growing up, Polyxena likely absorbed this reality with the quiet resignation that marked so many young princesses of her time. She was educated not simply to learn, but to represent, to carry herself with grace, to embody the dignity of her lineage, to become an ornament fit for a foreign court. Music, needlework, prayer, and perhaps a smattering of languages would have filled her days. Yet beneath the surface, there was always the unspoken truth. Her destiny lay not in Langenschwalbach, but in the halls of some distant palace, where she would serve not herself, but the ambitions of others. We cannot know her private feelings as a child, but we can imagine the sensation of growing up in a gilded cage. The town itself, with its therapeutic mineral springs and wooded valleys, offered fresh air and a sense of freedom. But that freedom was illusory. Every gesture, every lesson, every appearance before guests reinforced that she was not her own. She was already being prepared to be given away. There is a poignant irony here. Polyxena was born into privilege compared to commoners who tilled the soil or lived by the sweat of their craft. Yet her privilege was its own form of captivity. The peasant girl could, at least in theory, choose her husband. Polyxena never would. Her family name was a chain draped in velvet, beautiful but unyielding. By the time she reached adolescence, Europe was alive with shifting alliances, especially in Italy, where rival dynasties vied for control. The Savoy dynasty, eager to strengthen its position, looked northward to German principalities for a bride who could legitimize their ambitions. For Polyxena, it meant that her childhood home was not the beginning of her story, but merely the prologue to an existence already mapped out. Her life's path, then, was set before she had even learned to walk. Born a princess, she would never be allowed to live as simply a woman. In the summer of 1724, Turin erupted in celebration. Trumpets sounded, church bells rang, and courtiers lined the streets in silk and brocade. Yet behind the glittering facade of ceremony stood an 18-year-old bride whose destiny had already been decided. Polyxena of Hesse Rotenburg. She had been chosen to marry Charles Emmanuel III, King of Sardinia, a man 10 years her senior, who ruled a kingdom still uncertain of its place among Europe's great powers. The marriage was more than a union of two people. It was a transaction, a diplomatic handshake dressed in lace and jewels. For the House of Savoy, still consolidating its strength after wars and shifting borders, Polyxena was a strategic link to the German princely states. For her family, the match elevated their standing, offering them proximity to a royal crown. No one asked Polyxena what she wanted. In dynasties, desire was irrelevant. Duty was the only coin that mattered. The wedding itself dazzled with grandeur. Candlelit banquets, endless toasts, and the solemn blessing of the church framed the young queen's entrance into her new world. To the crowd, she was radiant. Pale, composed, cloaked in jewels that caught the firelight. But beneath the veil, Polyxena must have felt the dissonance between spectacle and truth. She was stepping not into a fairy tale, but into a contract, one in which her body would be the guarantor of dynastic survival. Charles Emmanuel III was no villain, but neither was he a man inclined toward tenderness. Reserved, pragmatic, focused on the machinery of state and the chessboard of European politics, he viewed marriage as duty rather than devotion. He needed heirs, sons who would secure the Savoy line, daughters who could be married off to cement alliances. Polyxena's role was clear from the beginning. She was to be the vessel of continuity. For an 18-year-old who had grown up in the wooded valleys of Germany, Turin must have felt like another planet. The Savoy court was ornate but cold, steeped in rigid etiquette and suspicion of outsiders. Every word she spoke was weighed, every gesture observed, every mistake whispered about in corridors heavy with intrigue. She was now Queen of Sardinia, but her crown was also a cage, its gold pressing down like invisible iron. And yet, in those first years, Polyxena tried to play her part with dignity. She smiled at ceremonies, attended Mass with devotion, and walked among her people with an air of gentleness. To the citizens of Turin, she was a fresh presence, a softer contrast to the calculating machinery of Savoy politics. They saw not just a foreign queen, but a woman who carried herself with kindness, even as her life became a stage directed by others. The marriage bound her to power, but it also bound her to silence. Behind the processions and portraits, behind the silks and glittering halls, a quiet truth remained. Polyxena's fate was no longer her own. Her life was absorbed into the rhythm of a dynasty, and from this moment forward, every breath she took was expected to serve the crown. Turin, with its Baroque facades and sweeping boulevards, could be an austere place. Its court was famed for rigid ceremony, its nobles for suspicion, its politics for endless calculation. And yet, amid that marble hardness, Polyxena emerged as something unexpected, a figure of softness, a queen whose presence felt less like command and more like quiet balm. She was not the kind of ruler who dazzled with brilliance or reshaped kingdoms with iron will. Instead, her influence was felt in smaller, subtler ways. She visited convents and hospitals, extending not only donations, but her own presence. In an age when royal charity was often impersonal, a matter of coin tossed to prove piety, Polyxena leaned closer. She listened to the sick, offered words to the poor, and gave a human face to a court otherwise veiled in formality. For the people of Turin, that mattered. Her compassion contrasted sharply with the calculated detachment of Savoy politics. Charles Emmanuel III was efficient, disciplined, and distant. His focus was on armies and treaties, on balancing power against France, Spain, and Austria. Beside him, Polyxena seemed almost like sunlight through a shuttered window. Narrow, fleeting, but warm enough to be remembered. To the women of the city, she represented dignity under pressure, To the men, she embodied virtue in a court that too often prized ambition above all. There are accounts of her involvement in charitable works, of her support for institutions that cared for orphans and widows. These were not sweeping reforms, but they were threads of kindness woven into the tapestry of Turin. She became, for a time, the good queen, remembered less for political maneuvering and more for a tenderness rare in the harsh air of dynastic ambition. And yet, even as she won hearts, the weight of expectation never loosened. Every glance at her in public, every whisper in the halls of the palace carried the same unspoken question. Would she provide heirs? Her popularity could soften perception, but it could not erase the iron law of monarchy. A queen's worth was measured not in gentleness, but in the survival of her line. Still, there was a grace in the way Polyxena balanced both worlds. She played the dutiful consort, standing beside her husband at ceremonies, her expression calm, her movements measured. And then, away from the gilded rooms, she slipped into roles that felt closer to her own nature, offering comfort, showing kindness, practicing faith. It was as if she carried two faces, one carved for the stage of monarchy, and another that whispered of the woman beneath the crown. This duality would become the rhythm of her life in Turin, the gentle queen who brought moments of warmth to her people, and the silent queen whose body and soul would soon be demanded by the relentless machinery of dynastic survival. For now, though, she stood at the height of her grace, respected, admired, and beloved. A fragile flower rooted in the stone gardens of power. In the gilded chambers of Turin, time was measured not in seasons, but in pregnancies. From the moment Polyxena wore her crown, her body ceased to be entirely her own. It became a vessel of expectation, a calendar written in the swelling of her belly and the cries of newborns. Between 1725 and 1735, her existence narrowed to one unrelenting rhythm: conception, birth, recovery, and then the cycle repeated, often before her strength had returned. Her first son, Victor Amadeus, born in 1726, was greeted with fireworks, cannon salutes, and joyous proclamations. For Charles Emmanuel III and the dynasty of Savoy, it was proof that the line would continue. For Polyxena, it was her first descent into the valley of pain, the bloody passage that all royal brides were expected to endure with stoic silence. She was only 20. Her body barely healed before she was asked to begin again. In the decade that followed, Polyxena bore 6 children. Of them, only 3 would live to adulthood. The others slipped away like candles extinguished in the night, infants who never knew the world beyond their cradle, whose cries echoed briefly before vanishing into silence. Each loss carved a deeper shadow across Polyxena's spirit. To the court, she had fulfilled her duty by producing an heir. To Polyxena herself, the cost was written in her bones and in the graves of her children. Imagine her life in those years, the palace corridors echoing with footsteps of physicians and midwives, the rooms heavy with the scent of herbs and candle smoke. Each confinement was cloaked in secrecy, women bustling in hushed tones, attendants bracing for complications. In an age when childbirth was still as perilous as a battlefield, every delivery was a wager against death. For ordinary women, it was terrifying. For queens, it was also political theater. Success meant security. Failure meant whispers of weakness. Her body became the stage of the dynasty's survival. With every new pregnancy, courtiers speculated, ambassadors reported, and allies recalculated their trust in Sardinia's future. Polyxena was praised when she delivered sons, pitied or ignored when tragedy struck. The cruelty of it was not only in the physical toll, but in the way her most intimate sufferings were made public property. A miscarriage, a stillbirth, an infant's death, all became matters for the court ledger, reduced to statistics in the chronicles of Savoy. And yet, beneath that cold record, there was the reality of a young woman enduring endless cycles of exhaustion. She would emerge from labor pale and trembling, only to be reminded that rest was a luxury she could not afford. Her body was summoned again and again, as though it were an inexhaustible well. But each draw left her weaker. By her mid-20s, she had aged beyond her years. Her face, once bright with youthful glow, now carried the gray pallor of constant depletion. To the outside world, she remained the gentle queen, still appearing at ceremonies, still offering kindness to her people. But the contrast grew starker. A woman who smiled in public while privately crushed beneath the relentlessness of her role. Her beauty became a mask, her duties a cloak concealing a body and spirit unraveling. There is a cruel metaphor often applied to royal women of the era. They were fields in which dynasties planted their hopes. Polyxena embodied this truth with painful clarity. The field was fertile, but every harvest drained the soil until little remained. And unlike the fields of the countryside, hers could not be left fallow. The plow returned again and again, indifferent to the damage it caused. The palace, with its marble walls and painted ceilings, became less a home than a crucible. Each chamber reminded her of some chapter in the cycle. Rooms where she had labored, beds where she had wept, corridors where she had heard the tiny wails that would soon be silenced. Even the tapestries and gilded mirrors became witnesses to her trials, silent observers of the drama that consumed her body. What made this spiral more tragic was the lack of choice. Polyxena could not refuse, could not protest, could not ask for respite. To be a queen was to be both exalted and expendable. Her body belonged not to her, but to the crown. Her womb counted as part of the state's treasury. Each pregnancy was a matter of politics, each death of a child a risk to diplomacy. She lived as though her veins carried not blood, but contracts, each heartbeat pulsing with obligation. By the early 1730s, whispers of her declining health began to circulate. Her cough lingered, her frame grew thinner, her vitality seemed to ebb. And yet, the cycle continued. To the world, she was still young, still within the span of childbearing years. To Polyxena, those years stretched like a corridor with no end, each door leading to the same chamber of pain. It is tempting to imagine her in rare moments of solitude, perhaps by a palace window, gazing at the gardens of Turin, where roses bloomed freely without obligation. Did she envy their simplicity, their brief but natural lives? She had been raised to believe her destiny was noble, her role sacred. But what nobility was there in being slowly broken by the very duty that defined her? The spiral of childbirths was not only the story of her body, but the shaping of her fate. Each child born, each child lost, each scar left upon her fragile health brought her closer to the silence of 1735. And though no one said it aloud, the court must have known. The very role that had secured her crown was the same force that would destroy her. Every court has its sounds. The rustle of silk in long corridors, the clang of bells marking the hours, the fanfare of trumpets for royal processions. But for Polyxena, the most enduring sound was smaller, more fragile. The cry of an infant, sometimes lasting only hours, sometimes days, before dissolving into silence. She had given the dynasty what it demanded. Victor Amadeus, a son strong enough to carry the Savoy line forward. His survival secured her place as mother of an heir. Yet the crown exacted its price, and the price was cruel. The other children came swiftly, as though time were chasing her body, and just as swiftly, they vanished. One child's breath faltered in the night, physicians powerless, attendants helpless as tiny lips turned pale. Another was stillborn, never drawing air at all. A life ended before it began. Each time, the palace shifted into a peculiar rhythm of grief. Priests summoned, bells rung softly, courtiers whispering condolences in polished tones. But the queen's sorrow was not ceremonial. It was raw, physical, like a weight pressing down on her lungs. In portraits of the age, royal women often sit surrounded by children, their identities confirmed by the brood that gathers at their skirts. For Polyxena, those imagined portraits would always be half empty. She could not look upon her surviving children without remembering the others. Every cradle reminded her of an empty one. Every baptismal gown called to mind the garments that were never worn. The repetition of loss worked upon her spirit like water carving stone. At first, she wept openly, the way any young mother would. But grief in the palace was not meant to last. Protocol demanded composure. The kingdom moved forward, indifferent to a queen's private despair. Over time, her tears turned inward. She became quieter, her smiles thinner, her silences longer. The people still saw their gentle queen, but her gentleness had grown more fragile, like glass clouded by too many touches. It is said that grief is cumulative, that each new wound deepens the scars of the old. For Polyxena, the burial of children became a cruel ritual, one that blurred together until the years themselves seemed measured by funerals. She was in her 20s, yet she carried the sorrow of an old woman who had buried generations. Her attendants sometimes remarked on the shadows beneath her eyes, on how she lingered at the cradles of the sickly, unwilling to leave even when urged. She could not protect them, but she could be present, as though her nearness might keep them tethered to life. And always, the cycle continued. Charles Emmanuel, practical and unbending, insisted on the necessity of heirs. He was not heartless. He too felt the sting of loss. But to him, grief was secondary to dynastic survival. Where she saw children, he saw succession. Where she saw graves, he saw political necessity. Their marriage, already formal, grew colder with each tragedy. They were bound not by shared tenderness, but by duty in the graves of the children they had lost. Polyxena's sorrow was compounded by isolation. In her homeland of Hesse Rotenburg, she might have found comfort among sisters or cousins. In Turin, she was surrounded by courtiers who measured her value in womb and womb alone. The people still adored her, yes, but adoration could not cradle her in the night, could not speak to her in her native tongue when grief pressed too heavily. She was both queen and stranger, beloved yet profoundly alone. The palace itself mirrored her anguish. Rooms where she had given birth became haunted chambers, their tapestries holding echoes of screams, their beds stained with memories of blood and loss. She would pass through those corridors and feel the weight of absence, the way light filtered differently through a window, the way a chair stood unused, the way silence gathered in corners where once there had been breath. There is a cruel irony in how history records such women. In official chronicles, their children are listed like entries in a ledger. Born, baptized, died. Dates replace lives. Names become footnotes. But for the mother, each loss was not an entry, but a universe undone. Polyxena lived not among statistics, but among ghosts, each one trailing her like a shadow. And yet she carried on. She appeared at masses, gave alms, received ambassadors, smiled at her surviving son. To the world, she was still queen, still performing her role. But grief had hollowed her, carved out spaces inside her that no crown could fill. She walked the palace halls like a candle burning too quickly, flame leaning toward extinction. What words could have captured her heart then? Perhaps none. Grief often resists language. But her life itself spoke, even in silence. It told the story of a woman both exalted and undone. A mother whose crown could not shield her children, a queen whose throne stood on graves. By the early 1730s, the repetition of death had changed her utterly. She no longer looked like the young bride who had entered Turin a decade earlier. The years of childbirth and loss had taken their toll, leaving her pale, thin, and marked by a sorrow that no powder or jewels could disguise. She was 27, yet her eyes carried the weight of centuries. Her legacy, even then, was becoming clear. She was not to be remembered for treaties signed or palaces built, but for the simple, devastating truth that she had lived as so many royal women did. Between cradle and coffin, between expectation and erasure. And in those years of repeated sorrows, her fate was sealed more surely than any contract could dictate. Every monarchy is a stage, and every queen a performer. In Turin, the Savoy court demanded endless performances. Each gesture carefully scripted, each silence interpreted, each smile measured. For Polyxena, already weakened by the toll of repeated childbirths and haunted by the graves of her children, this stage became suffocating. The gilded halls that had once seemed imposing now pressed upon her like walls closing in. Charles Emmanuel III governed with discipline, obsessed with the delicate balance of power that kept Sardinia afloat between greater forces: France, Spain, Austria. He was not a tyrant, but he was a man of calculation, pragmatic to the point of coldness. For him, Polyxena was valuable only as a queen consort, a bridge to German allies, a body capable of producing heirs, a figurehead to calm the people. Love had never been part of the arrangement, and sympathy had no place in his view of governance. Thus, while Polyxena's health faltered and her spirit dimmed, her responsibilities did not lessen. She was still expected to attend ceremonies, to sit through endless audiences, to walk at her husband's side in processions that proclaimed strength even when weakness gnawed at her body. Her cough was worsening, her frame thinning. But appearances had to be preserved. The queen must be seen. The queen must endure. At court, her every move was under scrutiny. Ambassadors from Vienna and Madrid whispered reports about her health, noting with cold precision whether she appeared robust enough to bear more children. Courtiers speculated about her fertility, her capacity, her failures. To them, she was not a woman, but a vessel, an extension of dynastic ambition. If she faltered, she became a liability, not only to her husband, but to the entire political web Sardinia struggled to maintain. The pressure was relentless. When she lost a child, there was no allowance for her grief. Instead, whispers began. Would she recover quickly enough to conceive again? When she coughed during Mass, eyes narrowed. Was the queen weakening beyond repair? Even her moments of kindness, her visits to hospitals and convents, were interpreted as gestures of propaganda, as though compassion itself could be reduced to calculation. Polyxena bore these burdens quietly. She had no choice. Open protest was impossible. Queens who defied expectation were condemned as selfish or mad. So she swallowed her sorrow, straightened her posture, and moved through the marble corridors like an actress repeating a role she could not refuse. Her crown glistened, but it felt heavier with each passing year, as if every jewel embedded in it was a stone of judgment pressing her down. Behind the curtain of ceremony, isolation deepened. She had left her German homeland behind at 18, and in Turin she remained an outsider. The Savoy aristocracy treated her politely, but seldom warmly. They saw in her not a friend or sister, but a necessary presence, a piece of political architecture. And so, when grief overtook her, when illness sapped her, she found few shoulders upon which to lean. This loneliness was sharpened by the very walls of the palace. Its Baroque beauty was undeniable, but beauty without warmth becomes cruel. The frescoes stared down impassively. The tapestries muffled her cries. The echo of her footsteps reminded her daily how far she was from home. It was a palace of mirrors, but none reflected her inner life. To survive, Polyxena cultivated composure, a mask she wore with increasing perfection. She smiled at her people, because the people gave her back something the court never did: affection untainted by politics. When she appeared among them, she was greeted with admiration, even love. They saw not a fragile body, but a queen who cared, who gave them presence and dignity. In those moments, she seemed to breathe more freely, as if the air of Turin belonged less to the palace and more to the streets. Yet these brief respites could not erase the tension gnawing at her. Her husband's gaze, the eyes of foreign envoys, the gossip of courtiers, all reminded her that she was not free. She was a chess piece, and her value was weighed not in kindness, but in outcomes. The paradox was brutal. She was adored by the people for her gentleness, but judged by power for her failures. The political climate only intensified her suffering. Wars flickered on the horizon, alliances shifted with each treaty, and the Savoy dynasty needed stability more than ever. In this fragile balance, Polyxena was not allowed to falter. Her weakness, her illness, her repeated losses, these were risks that could ripple outward, unsettling trust in the dynasty's endurance. She lived not only for herself or her children, but for an entire political order that consumed her without mercy. It is difficult, even now, to grasp the cruelty of such a life. A woman in her 20s, already gaunt and coughing from what we now recognize as tuberculosis, still forced to rise, dress in brocade, and smile through ceremonies while her heart ached and her body failed. A queen whose personal tragedy was ignored, even weaponized, by the very court she served. And yet, through it all, she maintained her quiet dignity. Perhaps it was faith that sustained her, her devotion to the church, her prayers whispered in chapels where flickering candles were the only witnesses. Perhaps it was memory, the face of her surviving children, especially her son, who would one day ascend the throne she had paid for with her own strength. Or perhaps it was simply endurance, the stubborn will of a woman determined to play her role, even as it consumed her. Polyxena's life in these years was the embodiment of contradiction. Loved and unloved, visible yet unseen, powerful and powerless. The court demanded perfection, but offered no mercy. The people adored her, but could not save her. She was trapped in the machinery of monarchy, a cog that ground down until nothing remained but fragments of a once vibrant woman. And in that contradiction, her tragedy deepened. For the court, she was an expendable vessel. For history, she became a forgotten name. But in her time, in her silence, she was something more. A queen who endured the crushing weight of politics, even as it hollowed her from within. By her mid-20s, Polyxena had begun to look far older than her years. The court painters still tried to capture her as a serene young queen, draped in velvet and pearls, but no pigment could hide the truth that was etched into her face. Her cheeks had hollowed, her frame thinned, her skin had lost its glow. She carried herself with dignity, yes, but it was the dignity of someone fighting not to collapse in public. The years of relentless childbirth had already drained her body. But now another enemy pressed in. Tuberculosis, the great scourge of the 18th century. It was called the White Plague, and it crept quietly into lungs, feeding on breath until there was none left. For Polyxena, it began with the cough, a dry, persistent sound that interrupted prayers and echoed through palace chambers. At first, courtiers dismissed it as fatigue, but as weeks turned into months, the cough deepened, punctuated by blood-stained cloths hurriedly hidden from view. The irony was cruel. A queen meant to embody vitality and dynastic strength was, in truth, wasting away from within. Her attendants watched her climb palace staircases with increasing difficulty, pausing often, her hand pressed against her chest as though to steady her breath. Meals grew lighter. She had little appetite, and food that once nourished now seemed burdensome. Her gowns, once snug, now hung loosely, as if she were vanishing inside them. Yet appearances had to be maintained. Even as her lungs weakened, she continued to appear beside Charles Emmanuel at ceremonies, her posture straight, her face powdered to conceal pallor. In candlelit halls, she seemed almost spectral, present but fading, like a figure dissolving into the shadows of her own palace. The courtiers who whispered about her decline did so in the language of diplomacy, not compassion. The queen appears fragile, they would write to foreign courts. As if fragility were not tragedy, but simply a footnote in the ledger of dynastic calculations. Behind closed doors, her suffering was intimate, unrelenting. Tuberculosis is not merely an illness of the body. It is an erosion of daily life. Nights were the worst. Hours of coughing, lungs burning, attendants rushing with cloths and water. Sleep was fleeting, fractured by spasms that left her trembling. And when she did rest, her dreams were haunted by memories. The children she had lost, the weight of duties unfulfilled, the crown that had never offered solace. Her body had become a battlefield, fought over by two relentless forces, illness and expectation. The illness stripped her strength, while expectation demanded she keep giving more. More appearances, more children, more proof that she was still the queen the court needed her to be. In truth, she had become a shadow of that queen. Every day was survival, every gesture an act of endurance. There is a telling metaphor for her decline. The candle. In earlier years, she had burned brightly, admired by the people, loved for her kindness. But tuberculosis was like a steady draft, invisible yet persistent, causing her flame to gutter. She remained upright, but every flicker revealed the nearness of extinguishment. And still, she tried to live. She found solace in her faith, kneeling in the chapel where incense smoke curled upward like prayers seeking escape. She leaned on the small joys that remained, a tender word from her surviving son, a moment of fresh air in the palace gardens, the warmth of sunlight on stone. These were fragments of life she clung to, reminders that even in weakness, she was more than her suffering. But the court could not, or would not, acknowledge the depth of her decline. To them, illness was an inconvenience, not an absolution. The machine of monarchy kept turning, and Polyxena was still expected to serve as one of its wheels. Even as her cough worsened, rumors swirled about whether she might attempt another pregnancy. as though her body had not already been broken by the last. The cruelty of such expectations is hard to fathom today. But in her time, it was simply the unspoken law of queenship. You give until you are gone. By 1734, her health had become impossible to disguise. Those who saw her closely spoke of her consumption. The word whispered in corridors like a death sentence. The people of Turin, once cheered by her presence, now looked upon her with sorrow. They adored her still. But their queen no longer radiated strength. Instead, she seemed fragile, like porcelain too thin to handle, her life one tremor away from shattering. It was then that the duality of her existence became starkest. To the world, she remained the gentle queen, kind, charitable, a soft presence amid the hardness of politics. But to herself, she was a woman unraveling, a body giving way to illness, a heart heavy with loss. Her crown, once a symbol of status, now felt like an anchor pulling her further down. Perhaps the cruelest element of her suffering was its inevitability. In an age without effective medicine, tuberculosis was a slow executioner, granting no reprieve. She must have known, as her strength dwindled, that her days were numbered. And yet, like so many women of her station, she bore it in silence, wrapped in composure even as her body betrayed her. By 27, she resembled not the bride who had entered Turin a decade earlier, but a ghost of that girl. Her laughter was gone, her vitality drained, her face marked with the solemn knowledge that she was nearing the end. The spiral of childbirth had led her here. The disease simply sealed what duty had begun. Her body was collapsing, but her endurance remained. She walked through those final months with a fragile dignity that spoke louder than any words. It was the dignity of a queen who had given everything, and whom history would soon forget. By the winter of 1734, the palace of Turin had grown quiet around Queen Pollixina. The music of celebrations, the chatter of courtiers, the hurried steps of attendants, all seemed to dim, as though the building itself anticipated the silence to come. The queen who had once walked those corridors with grace and warmth now moved rarely, confined more often to her chambers, her strength flickering like a candle struggling against the draft. Her decline had become undeniable. Tuberculosis, relentless and merciless, had reduced her to fragility. She was 28, but her body bore the exhaustion of someone far older. Friends and attendants whispered of her pallor, the thinness of her frame, the tremor in her hands. The vibrant young bride who had entered Turin a decade earlier was gone. In her place remained a queen worn down by years of childbirth, grief, and disease. Those who saw her in her final weeks often spoke of her eyes. They had grown darker, more hollow, yet they retained a quiet depth, a gaze that seemed to look past the present, beyond the palace walls, as if she were already reaching toward something unseen. She spent long hours in prayer, kneeling before the crucifix in her chamber, lips moving silently, hands clasped tightly. Faith had always been a comfort, but now it became her anchor, the only realm in which she could still exercise choice, the choice to surrender, to trust, to endure. Outside her chamber, life went on. Turin's streets bustled, treaties were signed, armies prepared, courtiers gossiped. Within the palace, Charles Emmanuel continued to govern, his attentions fixed on maps, alliances, and the precarious balance of Sardinia's survival. He visited her, but his visits were brief, formal, the gestures of a husband-king more than of a partner. He had affection, perhaps even sorrow, but duty pulled him elsewhere. Polyxena did not reproach him. She had long understood her role in his life, essential but not central. What sustained her most in those days was her surviving children. Victor Amadeus, her eldest son, was still a boy, yet she watched him with the eyes of a mother who saw both fragility and promise. She knew he would one day inherit the throne, and she prayed he might live differently than she had. Less as a pawn of duty, more as a sovereign of choice. With him, she was tender, protective, though her strength allowed little more than whispered words and the brush of a hand across his hair. In those fleeting moments, she was not queen, but simply mother. The physicians of the time did what they could. Though their remedies were little more than ritual, they brought herbal tinctures, prescribed bleeding, recommended fresh air. None of it helped. Every breath grew shallower, every cough harsher, every day shorter. The palace air, heavy with incense and candle smoke, seemed to weigh on her chest. Sometimes she was carried to a balcony to breathe the cold winter air, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. From there she could see the city she had once walked, the people who had once cheered her. She must have known it was a farewell. As January of 1735 dawned, the Queen's decline quickened. The court grew tense, though etiquette demanded composure. Ambassadors wrote carefully phrased reports. The Queen's condition is grave. Priests came more frequently, their prayers lengthening, their voices softening. Candles burned constantly in her chamber, their wax dripping like the slow measurement of time. On January 13th, the end came. Accounts say she passed quietly, attended by her confessor and a handful of attendants. There was no dramatic final scene, no great proclamation. Instead, it was the silence of a young woman's body finally surrendering after years of relentless demand. She was 28 years old, an age that should have been the prime of life, yet for Polyxena marked its close. The official cause was recorded as tuberculosis, consumption. But those who knew her understood the deeper truth. It was not illness alone that killed her, but the exhaustion of duty. 10 years of childbirths, of funerals, of endless court appearances had broken her body long before disease claimed it. Her death was not sudden, but the final note of a song that had been fading for years. In the palace, her passing was marked with the rituals of mourning. Drapes were drawn, bells tolled, masses were said. Yet the grief seemed strangely muted. For Charles Emmanuel, the dynasty continued. He had his heir. He still had a throne to guard. For the court, another queen was gone, and politics pressed onward. Within days, attentions had shifted to the practical. Arrangements for burial, considerations for the king's next marriage, the continuation of alliances. But for the people of Turin, the loss was felt more deeply. They had adored Polyxena for her kindness, her gentleness, her presence among them. To them, she was not simply another queen in a line of rulers, but a figure who had softened the hardness of monarchy. In their prayers, her name was spoken with tenderness, her memory preserved not in treaties, but in acts of compassion they had witnessed. Her body was laid to rest in Turin, interred with solemn ceremony. The coffin, borne through the city, was draped in black and gold, accompanied by torches that flickered in the cold winter air. Crowds lined the streets, some crossing themselves, some whispering prayers, some simply watching in silence as the young queen passed one final time. And then she was gone, buried beneath stone, her name carved into marble, her presence reduced to memory. Yet, in that silence, her tragedy lingered. She had been queen, mother, consort, pawn. She had been beloved and forgotten, exalted and erased. And in the end, her death was less a rupture than a vanishing, an extinguished flame that left the palace colder, the city quieter, the dynasty heavier with the weight of what it demanded from her. Polyxena of Hesse Rotenburg died not in scandal or triumph, but in exhaustion. Her crown did not save her. It only made her silence more profound. After the funeral rites concluded, Turin returned to its rhythm. The court could not pause for long. Alliances still shifted, armies still marched, treaties still hung precariously in balance. For Charles Emmanuel III, grief was quickly absorbed into duty. He had heirs, he had a throne to defend. And so, Polyxena's death, devastating in the intimacy of her chamber, became but a footnote in the broader chronicle of Savoy. There were prayers said in her name, solemn masses offered, and her body was placed in Turin's royal crypt. Yet the stone that bore her name was less a monument than a marker, a line among many, the letters destined to fade beneath dust and candle smoke. Her portrait, once hung prominently in palace halls, was gradually moved aside to make room for the next queen, the next alliance, the next chapter. History, it seemed, had little appetite for her story. She had not been a regent. She had not waged war. She had not signed treaties that altered the course of nations. She was remembered briefly for her gentleness, admired by her people. But even that memory was fragile, lacking the weight to endure in dynastic records. In official histories, she became a name attached to a date. Polyxena of Hesse Rotenburg, Queen Consort of Sardinia, died 1735. It is a cruel fate, but not an uncommon one. Many queens consort of Europe passed this way. Women who gave their youth, their bodies, and often their lives to dynasties that treated them as expendable. They were mourned for a moment, praised with formal words, and then forgotten, their sacrifices buried beneath the weight of crowns they had sustained but never truly shared. Polyxena's tragedy was not only her death at 28, but the silence that followed it. In Turin, the people who had once loved her carried her memory longer. Among the poor she had helped, the nuns she had visited, and the sick she had comforted. Her name lingered. She was remembered not as a political figure, but as a presence. Soft, kind, human. But such memories do not make their way into history books. They survive in whispers, in prayers, in the faint trace of gratitude passed through generations. The Savoy dynasty moved forward. Charles Emmanuel remarried, the line secured itself through new alliances, and Polyxena was left behind. Her grave, another stone in a vault of kings and queens. Her children, especially Victor Amadeus, carried her blood, but even they would speak little of her in years to come. To survive in history, one must leave monuments of power. Polyxena left only the fragile memory of compassion, easily overshadowed by the clamor of politics. Thus, she became what so many royal women became: forgotten, a life measured in childbirths, a death unmarked by legacy, a queen erased not by scandal, but by neglect. And yet, in that forgetting lies the sharpest edge of her tragedy. For what is more haunting than to live, to suffer, to give everything, and then to vanish from memory, as though you had never been at all? Polyxena's story is not singular. Her death at 28 was not the first nor the last of queens undone by the very roles meant to exalt them. Across Europe, dynasties treated women like her as indispensable and disposable at once, essential for heirs, yet easily forgotten once their bodies gave way. The crown promised glory, but in truth it demanded silence, sacrifice, and often an early grave. Her tragedy lies in this paradox. She was queen, adorned with jewels and bowed to by nobles, yet powerless in the most intimate sense. She had no say in whom she married, no freedom to decide when or whether to bear children, no reprieve when grief hollowed her heart. In the grand game of dynasties, she was a pawn, and pawns were always the first to be sacrificed. Polyxena's death illustrates the brutal economy of monarchy. Her womb was currency, her health collateral, her life a ledger line in the survival of the Savoy dynasty. And when the account was closed, when she could give no more, her value to power ended. She became a memory in the crypt, her story lost to dust. Yet her humanity endures in the questions her life forces us to ask. What does it mean to live surrounded by grandeur, yet die in neglect? What kind of power exalts a woman, only to consume her? What kind of history preserves the names of kings who signed treaties, but erases the women whose bodies bore the heirs that made those treaties possible? Her crown could not protect her. Instead, it weighed her down, pressing like iron beneath velvet, demanding her strength until nothing remained. And this is the enduring tragedy. The very thing that gave her status was also the thing that stripped her of self. The crown exalted her, but it also extinguished her. In remembering Polyxena, we are reminded of the countless others whose names are little more than lines in genealogies. Queens who smiled in portraits while hiding exhaustion, who walked in processions while mourning lost children, who were praised for producing heirs and discarded when their health failed. Their stories may not fill history books, but they echo in the silences between them. Polyxena's life was brief, her reign quiet, her death lonely, but her suffering speaks across centuries. It tells us that behind every marble tomb and gilded frame lies a human being, fragile and finite. It tells us that power without compassion corrodes not only those who wield it, but those bound beneath it. And it tells us that even forgotten queens matter, because in their silence we hear truths that history tried to erase. Polyxena of Hesse Rotenburg was not remembered for what she built or conquered, but for what she endured. And perhaps that is enough. For in her endurance, she stands as a mirror of all the women consumed by crowns, gentle souls turned into ghosts by the merciless weight of power.